Names like Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler, Captain Cipriani, and Kula Rienzi are rightly celebrated as influential leaders of the 1930s labor revolution. However, oftentimes, women of the labor movement, particularly Elmer Francois, whose name is rarely mentioned alongside these prominent men, are overlooked.
I think to identify the role of women, you have to go back before 1937, and I think that you have to understand women's involvement in movement and resistance generally in Trinidad and Tobago. So in the first instance, you have as early as 1918, 1919, you have Daisy Crick from South Trinidad, who organizes her own social welfare association in the South and mobilizes, in particular, unemployed women. That organization, well, because of the work she does in that organization, she becomes involved with Cipriani and the Trinidad Working Men's Association and becomes the de facto leader of the women's arm of that organization. And I think that then leads to a snowball, if you will, of women being involved in activism directly. So in the 1930s, 1934, you have a series of hunger strikes. And when you read the reports from these strikes, they tell you about hundreds of women being part of these strikes because the women played a critical role on the plantations. They were weeders, and played other roles, not just this idea that we have that women were only domestics. They were very functional in the field as well. So when wages were low or the tasks were too much, this affected the women directly. And so that they came out, and a lot of these marches, they would have come out with their children. So you'd have reports talking about large numbers of women and children in these hunger marches.
Elmer Francois distinguished herself in the realm of political and social activism through a distinctive approach. She held candlelit rap sessions in public squares throughout the capital, using these informal gatherings to enlighten and educate the nation's citizens.
So Elmer Francois is an interesting individual in our history. So Elmer would have come to Trinidad from St. Vincent in 1919. She was, at the time in Trinidad, she would have been a domestic employee, right? Washing, cleaning, like that. When she was in St. Vincent, she had worked on the plantations. She was picking cotton, and another time later on she had worked at one of the sugar fields. She lost her job in the cotton field because she had started, as young as she had started to agitate and mobilize the workers there, and she was dismissed. So when she came to Trinidad, she had already had a sense of mobilization, agitation, and so on. And then when she came here in 1919, she had focused a lot on mobilizing the women around her, mobilizing the communities. And before long, she would have found, she would have found camaraderie with people like Jim Barrett and so on. And they would have then formed the National Union, the National Unemployed Movement, So they mobilized unemployed workers, which is significant to understand what eventually happens in 1937. The National Unemployed Movement would then become the Negro Welfare Social and Cultural Association. And I think there are 2 or 3 key points that we have to understand about Elmer Francois. One, you have this person who has up to a standard 5 education, but she is well read. In fact, Jim Barrett says that he was not interested in politics that much, and it is his engagement with Elmer Francois and her penchant for reading, and she introduced him to a lot of literature that that would eventually raise his own consciousness and see him become a lot more active as a political activist.
Taking a flashback to the past of leading women in the labor movement, Clotel Walcott and Salisha Ali and others established the National Union of Domestic Employees in 1974. NUD made history by forming the first and only all-female executive within a trade union. Today, the union is led by Ida LeBlanc.
Some of the key women included names that are not well known. In fact, some of the names that are recorded, they're not even their full name. There's a woman called Atkins who was very vibrant in Captain Arthur Cipriani's Trinidad Working Men's Association. You had Thelma Williams, Daisy Crick in the OWTU. So there are a few names throughout the unions, and what I've realized is that many of their names are not recorded, but sometimes their activities are recorded. Some of these issues that women fought for included the right to vote. And not just the right to vote, but the right to be eligible to be representatives in our legislative council, which is today our parliament. And women did not have the right, they did not satisfy income and property qualifications because they were women, they were excluded from voting rights. And they still attended political parties, they still attended the meetings, they still were there, speaking on the platforms, the electoral platforms. So it's very interesting to see that women were so interested in fighting for not just rights for them to vote, but other men who were excluded because they didn't satisfy the criteria, be it income and property. So they were there fighting for that. They were also fighting for better wages. They were fighting for better employment practices. During the 1937 riots, there were women who supported their husbands who were involved in the protests. Some of the husbands and partners who were jailed, the women went to bring food for them, went to visit them, gave them support. Sometimes the history books don't talk about that. They don't talk about the support that the women give. Sometimes the history books just give numbers. I found from the research that we actually had women involved in our women's movement who were outside from the Caribbean. There were two women from Ireland, Frances Cahill and Kathleen Donnellan. They were teachers at the Catholic Women's Training College, and they also taught at St. Joseph Convent in Port of Spain. And they were fired because they supported and they took part in lectures organized by the Public Works Workers Trade Union. And they had to spend time in the internment camp in St. James. Kathleen Donnellan actually committed suicide. And Britain had actually passed defense regulations. And anybody considered speaking or writing that was considered anti-war, anti-British propaganda could be jailed. So we had brave women in Trinidad and Tobago, throughout the Caribbean, and also abroad who were putting pressure on the colonial authorities to improve wages, better working conditions, and to allow freedom of speech. Some of the major changes include women being allowed the right to vote, women being allowed to represent themselves and others on the borough council, the municipal council, so that we had women in the 1940s into the 1950s starting to take greater political representation. Some employers were actually forced to give maternity leave for a few weeks because of the pressure that the unions were putting on these employers. Some of these women who fell ill, when they stayed home, they didn't get paid, and their unions protested, and they were able to get this leave, this time off. So I think that what the women did was that they fought shoulder to shoulder with the men. But often the history books don't record these injustices that the women faced, and they also don't record the fight that the women were having in the trenches.
Where would the labor movement be without the vital contributions of women, whether working behind the scenes or leading from the front?
As a woman in labor, it's a very heavy task, meaning that a lot is expected from you as a woman. It is, by all reason, we have seen, history have shown it, that it is a male-dominated field. But as women, we break the barriers, right? Women, as we know it to be, in the home, for example, we are homemakers. Men are the head of the home, but women are the homemakers. We make the home, we do things, we bring a family together. Likewise, that is what it is in the trade union movement. Men have the pivotal role or the main role, the staple role of leading the organization, but women have always been that level of support. Now, history will show us George Weeks to Roger, now we are seeing from Matthews to Ermine DeBeek, MEAD, that's in Contractors and General Workers Trade Union, communication workers, from the great Lyle Townsend to me, right? And what we have actually seen, women have always been around, but we have accepted then that it's a man's world. We have changed the status quo by redefining what trade unionism means. And coming from a woman's point of view, we look at including all and sundry. So having assumed the role now as Secretary General for the period or for the term 2023 to 2026, prior to that, I held the role of President to the former Secretary General, Comrade Clyde Elder. What does that role mean to me? Actually, to be honest, leadership is a heavy role. So heavy is the head that wears the crown. For me, being the Secretary General now, it encompasses a lot more responsibility. And being the president, I had the administrative role of running the union. Now I have more of the operational aspect, where I am in charge of the labor relations operations of the union. Most of the decision making lies with me or rests with me, and I have a complement of 11 officers, 10 including myself, as an executive board, to which what I practically pride myself on is education in today's society, especially in the trade union movement. Women deserve to be in places where all decisions are made. I cannot say that I say, okay, this particular trade unionist, I look at, I believe her name is Telma, I can't recall her surname right now, but I believe she was responsible for having the first women's auxiliary arm or women's arm of the OWTU, and her resilience is something that I looked at. Because if you look at, in stark contrast, if you were to look at her contribution then to now, we are more in a area or era where we are open to technology, we are open to different ideas. Back then, based on her resilience and her commitment to the movement, she would have made that happen. So for all women listening, let's break those barriers. Let's start to communicate, let's make a network, and let's grow this thing. Women deserve to be in all places where decisions are made, and it starts with you.
And I know this is an indictment on men, but my classes are predominantly women. So when we get into the class, you have a lot more women coming to the college than men. So what does that mean? It means that they are positioning themselves in leadership roles in a more significant way. And particularly for those in labor, it is important for them to understand the shoulders that they're standing on, so that they're not thinking that this is the first time or this is the first person. Or how do you learn from the lessons of those who've gone before, so that you don't repeat errors, or you don't think that this is a win doesn't exist.
Women are taking their places in the leadership of dynamic organizations such as trade unions and mobilizing their members in the fight for social justice and gender equality.